my name is Giovanni. I'm also an academic. I do sometimes I do work in meta science work, let's say, also with Silvio and Ludo. Ludo will speak later on. And I'm based at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm also helping a little bit with the ResearchHub as one of the editors for the Meta Science Hub, actually. So if you're curious about that, I try to put interesting papers in there from time to time. And I'm going to tell you something about the advantages of open research data. Now, the topic is open research data, right? And it's actually very fitting that Silvio just presented, because he really very well gave you the context of open research data as part of the broader effort within open science. And in a nutshell, why do we want to have research data openly available? So primarily because this allows for reproducibility of research results. I'm really following Silvio's definition here. So using the same data, the same code, exactly the same experimental design in order to check whether the results are exactly as reported in a paper. And for reusing the data, right? So different users expanding upon it, or what have you. So giving new life to this data. So reproducibility and reuse. As Silvio also mentioned, open research data is really part of the agenda, in particular of funding organizations and the open science network more broadly. I'm mentioning here, with a very European bias perspective, a few initiatives. For example, in the funding ecosystem, as researchers, we are increasingly asked to publish our data openly, and infrastructure initiatives such as Zenodo or OpenAIR are popping up to support researchers in doing so. Again, this is very European, but I hope you can think about similar initiatives in the countries where you are based. So point being that open research data is a big topic and an important one. Now, how is it that we make our data open? And in particular, how is it that we connect it with the paper that we actually publish? The way we mostly do it is through an extension, if you like, of the PDF format, right? So we all know that we are running by the PDF format in research with its limitations, and the primary way to add reference to the data supporting a paper is through what are called data availability statements. And you see an example here, right? So it's a paper of mine that I will be talking about in a moment. And here what we did is really to add short sentence, code and data can be found at, and then there is a DOI and so permanent identifier, and a link to a repository where everything is stored and documented. So a data availability statement is, a PDF technology that tells the reader of an article where the data supporting the results are, and where they can be found for further use. Now, what I want to talk about here are 2 points. One is, can we actually make a somewhat selfish reason to publish research data? Right? So we know that there is a push towards it. We know that transparency is good for the reasons that Silvio and myself mentioned, and therefore it's a good thing, right? But we also know that the point about incentives is still a little bit lacking, right? And publishing research data is actually an effort, right? Because you need to document it, you need to clean it up, you need to make it available, so it exposes you in some way, which is good, but also requires increased effort. So can we, is there a selfish reason to publish research data? And I think we found one, which might be interesting to researchers. And the second thing is, what is actually missing in publishing research data in terms of ecosystem, and in particular infrastructure and good practices, where I think the DSci community could really help. So starting from the first point, selfish case for providing data. In a paper a couple of years ago, myself and colleagues, we asked the following question, right? So, do we have a change in citations, in particular received citations that a paper gets over time after publication, if the data is also shared, right? So if an author or authors follow the good practice of publishing research data, do they get extra credit in terms of more citations that they receive? And if the answer is positive, then we can say that there is a kind of selfish case for data availability, because indeed received citation is an important metric for research evaluation. So what we did was to collect data, over 500,000 articles from 2 publishers, PLOS and BMC, Biomed Central, and to develop a pipeline in order to extract data availability statements and classify them in the following 4 categories. The categories go from 0 to 3, and they are, let's say, they are from not so good to very good in terms of open science good practices. So category 0, not so good, is the data is not available, right? I mean, there might be some good reasons for the data being not available. For example, a paper is not supported by any data analysis, so that's fine. Then we have category 1, which is data is available upon request. This is really not good, right? Because there are very many studies that have found that in this situation, very often the data is actually not available, and maybe the authors, they don't reply, or they don't provide sufficient amount of data to reproduce the results of the paper and whatever. Third option, not so bad, actually quite good. The data is available with the paper or supplementary files. Best is the data is available separately in a repository. Why this is best? Because a repository usually improves the accessibility, fungibility, and long-term storage of the data. I'll mention this in more detail later on. So we have these 4 categories, and then what we did was to, first of all, take a look at the development over time or usage over time of data availability statements. And we found that for both publishers, actually, the transition really happened when the publisher decided to mandate, right? So to really compel the authors to add a data availability statement in their articles. Before that, you see that transition point for the 2 publishers, so BMC on the left and PLOS on the right, with a thick black line in the 2 plots. And the plots are showing you the number of papers essentially over time in different colors according to whether they have a data availability statements or and the different categories. So there is a big transition when a mandate kicks in. And what is more, there is a big difference even at the publisher level, so very coarse aggregation level, in terms of actually which kind of data availability statement category authors use. For example, in BMC, they use much more upon request. In PLOS, they use much more in the paper or in a repository. But the key point here is that mandating seems to be kind of essential to have compliance. What is more, and likely the main finding of the paper, is that the question that I posed at the beginning is actually confirmed. So we run a regression analysis, so it's purely observational and correlational study, right? So it's really scratching the surface, but it points to a quite strong effect that papers have when they do have a data availability statement of category 3, actually. So when they do have data made openly available in an external repository. So when this happened, we were able to find an up to quarter more citations on average that are received after 3 years from publication, which is quite non-significant. I mean, it's pretty significant incentive, let's say, or selfish motivation to work on publishing data, and in particular in an external repository, so publishing it properly. Now, I won't spend much time on trying to speculate why this might be the case, right? Because again, with this experimental design, or observational study, we cannot really say much about it. But to say that there might be at least two big reasons that influence this effect or this trend. One is that, let's say that publishing data openly like this requires resources, so it's time consuming, and it might be the case that this is something that on average only the laboratories or the researchers that are better funded do more systematically. And we know that researchers that are better funded, they tend to have also received more citations, right? Because it's a self-reinforcing mechanism. On the other hand, though, hopefully this is also in part at least explained by positive impact of following open science practice, right? Because publishing data openly indeed allows for reproducibility and data reuse, which intuitively makes sense that it would foster citations to a certain paper, right? Because people can more easily build upon it. Be that it may, there is also a selfish case for publishing data openly and also properly, I'd say, so in an external repository. But this is also something that researchers seems to be the case, had to be pushed and have to be pushed, like not all of them, but most of them, to do so. Nevertheless, also, I think quite some not so glorious news. For example, there's only a relatively small, I think, fraction of publications in this specific study actually had a data availability statement of category 3, right? So 20% for PLOS and 12% for BMC. Again, there might be good reasons for this, right? So in particular, if you have data BMC, this is often the case from trials involving humans. It's often not really the case that you can publish it openly. But on the other hand, it also signals that still there is a way to go in terms of open publication of data being a more normal practice, I would say. But there is more to, I think, the negative news. In a recent and I think very, very interesting report that I encourage people in DSci to take a look at on scholarly communication during COVID, and in particular the response of the scholarly communication system to COVID. A group of researchers, including Ludo, that is going to speak after me, try to provide really a systematic overview of how the scholarly communication system reacted to COVID. And these kind of external shocks, they are, they're very bad, but in a sense they are good because they allow meta science people to actually study what is working and what is not working. And a lot of things are not working, as we know in science. In particular, it seems to be the case that for COVID, despite a strong push to publish openly, data was not really made openly available and not really systematically so, which is really a pity. Might be in part explained by the need to move really fast, but on the other hand, it's not really good because there was strong incentive to do so. In the same report, the authors suggest have a few recommendations for everyone involved in science, in the science ecosystem, in order to do a better job at publishing data. And I think these are also very good points for the DSci community when they design applications and new infrastructure. So in particular, again, adding data availability statements and really adding incentives for authors to do so. Following the FAIR guidelines, so making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable through metadata and using shared standards, and making data policies registered, very clearly, openly available so that people can easily follow them. In conclusion, though, I also think that making research data openly available, and in particular reaching this goal of systematic reproducibility of research results, requires something more than just the data. And I actually think it requires two things. One, it's a, let's say, computational full stack that is composed of good practices. So, for example, fair practices, artifacts, not just data, but also code and any relevant configuration, and a virtual environment that people can use in order to really reproduce results and play with the data. So for those familiar with machine learning, for example, Radio is a good example, right? So it's an online platform that allows to very easily make research result reproducible. This is one component. And the second component are incentives. As I was discussing with Silvio, we really need to, to give good reasons to researchers to do this effort, to make this effort. Good intentions are not enough, unfortunately. So this is something that I also think the Sci community can play a significant role, in particular, given its propensity for rapid and creative experimentation. I also put at the bottom there a couple of examples that I think are related, one from academia, the other one from DSci. So one is the Turing Way handbook, and the other one is the Ocean Protocol, that go really in this direction, and they do so, in my opinion, very well. So I encourage you to take a look if you're interested. And with that, I thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any question you might have.
Thank you, Giovanni. That was a really great talk. And I actually have a question for you from the audience. Luda just asked you, Giovanni, do you also know to what extent published data is actually being reused by other researchers? The fact that researchers cite an article that makes his data openly available doesn't necessarily mean that the citing researchers are reusing the data. It would be great to have an evidence of actual reuse. Do you know whether such evidence exists at the moment?
Yeah, Luda, thank you for the question. I think this is a great question, and it's kind of funny because I was trying, preparing even this presentation. I was trying to find kind of status of open research data paper, giving a kind of overview of how much, how many data is there, how much it is reused, what it is used for, and I couldn't find it. Could find only studies that are specific to different communities and the like, so I don't have a general answer. There might be something that I've missed, of course, but I don't have a general answer. I think this study is very much needed. So maybe we should discuss offline and do this study, actually. I suspect, though, that the answer to your specific question is going to change a lot according to the community. I see from, let's say, anecdotally at least, that in certain communities, practice of reusing data is much more systematically embedded in the research practice, thinking about machine learning community, for example. Whilst I think in other communities, much less so, right? Because there is less incentive to reuse the data, and there is much more incentive to do something new, completely new, right? So I wouldn't be surprised that if this were to be very different across communities. So I don't know much more about this. I mean, there are specific studies, of course, for different communities, but not overall big picture. So that sounds like a great topic for collaboration in the future. Or whoever wants to do it, feel free to ping us. I think we would be interested.